What if I told you that oversharing your life is slowly destroying your motivation, your mental clarity, and your sense of purpose without you even realizing it? In today's hyper-connected world, we've been conditioned to share everything. The moment we think of a goal, an idea, a dream, we feel compelled to talk about it. We tweet it, post it, announce it, text it. And on the surface, that looks like momentum. It looks like intention. But beneath the surface, something subtle but dangerous happens inside the brain. When you speak your goals too early, before they've been acted upon, your brain begins to reward you prematurely. Neuroscience shows us that when you share your aspirations, the same reward circuits light up in the brain as when you actually achieve them. Specifically, the nucleus accumbens, a core part of the dopamine system, releases a small dose of dopamine. This dopamine makes you feel good, accomplished, validated. Even though nothing has actually been built yet, that little spike of dopamine feels like progress. But it's not progress, it's an illusion of it. You've only spoken the dream, you haven't walked it, yet your brain begins to interpret that social recognition as partial fulfillment. This is where things start to quietly unravel. Your motivation to take action becomes diluted, your urgency weakens, your attention drifts, and without realizing it, you've already burned the fuel your brain was meant to use for actual effort. Now you're operating on fumes. This phenomenon is called social reality substitution. It's a well-documented effect in psychology and behavioral neuroscience. Your brain is wired to prioritize efficiency. So if it thinks a task is done or almost done, it will reduce the energy and focus it allocates toward that goal. This is why so many people struggle to follow through. They feel excited when they share a new goal, but within a few days, the momentum disappears. It's not because they're lazy. It's not because they lack talent. It's because their brain already got the reward. It cashed in too soon. This is especially dangerous for long-term goals. Things that require sustained effort, delayed gratification, and high cognitive demand. If you burn your dopamine early, your brain has no incentive left to grind through discomfort. You lose your edge before the real work even begins. But when you keep your life private, when you resist that urge to talk about it, you interrupt this loop, you delay the dopamine. And by doing so, you create tension. Psychological tension is not bad. In fact, it's one of the greatest drivers of action. When your brain expects a reward but doesn't receive it, it enters a state of motivated frustration. The ventral tegmental area, another key dopamine center, stays activated. Your mind begins searching for completion, for resolution, for forward motion. This is the essence of drive. It's not about hype. It's about psychological hunger. Hunger that comes from not being fed prematurely. Privacy forces you to sit with that hunger, to hold it, to protect it. And that hunger builds power. It keeps the prefrontal cortex engaged. The prefrontal cortex, as you know, is responsible for planning, impulse control, and focus. It is the part of your brain that says, not yet, when everything else is screaming, just share it. By exercising privacy, you strengthen that region. You train it like a muscle. Every time you choose silence over oversharing, you reinforce the neural circuits of restraint, discipline, and future orientation. More than that, privacy gives your actions room to breathe. When no one is watching, your brain is less concerned with image management. You're not performing, you're practicing, you're learning, you're failing and correcting without the pressure of optics. And in that space, neuroplasticity thrives. You create stronger, more stable neural pathways because your attention isn't fractured. Your focus is clean. Your intention is pure. The brain wires itself best when it's free from distraction and judgment. When you keep your path private, you gift yourself that environment. Privacy is not secrecy. It's a boundary that preserves energy. It's a psychological decision to redirect your dopamine back into the system that needs it most. Your effort, your learning, your adaptation. It's a relocation of motivation from words to action. And the impact compounds over time. You become someone whose rewards are earned, not imagined, whose progress is real, not performed. In a world addicted to sharing, choosing privacy is a neurological advantage. It's not weakness, it's control. The kind of control that rebuilds motivation, restores focus, and reclaims your deepest drive. We live in a time where silence is often mistaken for weakness, and privacy is seen as secrecy. But what most people don't realize is that silence is one of the most powerful tools we have for emotional regulation and mental clarity. When you constantly share your thoughts, your moves, your goals, or even your problems with the world, you train your brain to seek validation before resolution. Instead of solving the problem internally, your nervous system starts relying on the reaction of others to determine how you should feel. That's a fragile system. And over time, it breaks you down. The human brain is deeply social. From an evolutionary standpoint, being accepted by others was crucial to survival. This is why the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, is hypersensitive to social feedback. A slow reply, a lack of engagement, a misread facial expression. These tiny signals can trigger disproportionate stress responses. Cortisol spikes, heart rate increases. The brain begins interpreting these gaps in feedback as danger. You start overanalyzing, replaying conversations, questioning your worth, and all of this noise is rooted in one simple truth. Your brain has outsourced regulation. It's no longer stabilizing itself from within. It's waiting for the world to tell it how to feel. But when you choose silence, when you intentionally keep your thoughts and emotions contained, you force the brain to do something it doesn't often get the chance to do in our overstimulated society, regulate from within. This act of self-containment activates the anterior cingulate cortex, a part of the brain responsible for error monitoring and internal regulation. With practice, this area strengthens and your emotional swings become less reactive. You learn to sit in uncertainty without panic. You learn to hold your emotions without the need to perform them. Silence is not suppression. It's a form of strength training for the nervous system. When you don't post your frustration online, when you don't explain your every move to people who haven't earned that level of access, when you don't ask the world to agree with your pain, you allow your system to metabolize emotion organically. The limbic system, the emotional core of the brain, starts adapting. It becomes less volatile, less easily hijacked by external stimuli. You start building emotional grit, and that grit is what keeps you steady in chaos. When you constantly broadcast your inner world, you create emotional dependency. You start needing people to understand you before you can understand yourself. That's a dangerous trait because people won't always get it. They won't always validate it. And when they don't, your brain registers that gap as rejection. But when you practice silence, you remove the middleman. You bypass the need for interpretation. You go directly to the source, you, and that's where the healing starts. That's where resilience is built, not in the echo of applause, but in the quiet space where you learn to sit with your own truth. This isn't about isolation. It's about insulation. You are protecting your internal space from the noise of misinterpretation, misunderstanding, and misalignment. Every time you hold back from sharing something prematurely, you're giving your brain the opportunity to organize, to clarify, and to stabilize. This doesn't just impact your emotional state. It impacts cognition. Studies in cognitive neuroscience have shown that when the brain is under social threat or uncertainty, working memory declines. You literally can't think clearly when you're emotionally dysregulated, but silence acts as a buffer. It reduces external noise and gives the prefrontal cortex the bandwidth to make better decisions. Over time, this builds a deeper trust in yourself. You no longer need people to agree with your process because you've learned how to process independently. You don't need the room to understand your silence because you've made peace with the fact that not everything needs to be spoken to be real. And that internal security rewires your identity. You're no longer reactive. You're intentional. You don't speak to be heard. You speak when the words have weight. The truth is we live in an age of overexpression and under-reflection. Everyone is talking, but few are listening, especially to themselves. Silence reverses that. It makes space for the mind to hear itself, for the body to release what it's holding, and for the nervous system to reset. When you begin to treat your silence not as a void to be filled, but as a container for growth, you start becoming someone who doesn't need to be understood to feel whole, someone who finds power not in performance, but in presence. And that presence, calm, centered, unshaken, is what makes you truly powerful. The human brain is designed to adapt. That's its most powerful trait. But for the brain to truly change, to rewire itself at the neural level, it requires deep, sustained focus. This is the foundation of neuroplasticity. It's the mechanism by which we form new habits, unlearn toxic patterns, and build mental resilience. But neuroplasticity doesn't happen passively. It demands attention. And attention in today's world is fragmented. Every time you share a moment, an update, or an intention online, a piece of your attention is pulled outward. You start living in dual consciousness, half in the moment, half in the performance of it. And in that division, your brain loses the intensity it needs to make lasting changes. We often think that multitasking is a modern strength. But from a neurological standpoint, multitasking isn't real. What the brain does is switch rapidly between tasks, and that switching comes at a cognitive cost. When you split your focus, when you're doing something meaningful while simultaneously thinking about how it looks or how you'll share it, you reduce the depth of encoding. The hippocampus, which is responsible for memory consolidation, operates less efficiently under divided attention. The neural circuits that should be strengthening become weak, disjointed, or lost altogether. This is one reason people struggle to stay consistent with their growth. It's not just a matter of willpower. It's that their brain isn't getting enough intensity or repetition to make the new behavior stick. Privacy is the remedy. When you keep your progress to yourself, your mind becomes quieter. You stop tracking how your journey looks and start focusing on how it feels. You stop leaking energy into impressions and redirect it into embodiment. That level of presence is when neuroplasticity begins to accelerate. It's the difference between skimming a page and studying it line by line. When your full attention is on what you're doing, your brain begins to myelinate those circuits. Myelin is the insulation around neural pathways that makes them faster and more reliable. It doesn't grow through distraction. It grows through focused, undisturbed effort. This is why privacy is not just a mental habit. It's a neurobiological tool. Another element to consider is emotional safety. Every time we share something publicly, we invite the possibility of judgment, criticism, or misunderstanding. Even subtle social friction increases the brain's background stress. Cortisol levels rise, and elevated cortisol impairs both working memory and learning. When your nervous system is in a state of perceived threat, even if it's just the fear of being misunderstood, it shuts down the very systems responsible for learning and adaptation. The prefrontal cortex, which is critical for decision making and cognitive control, becomes less effective under stress. This means you're not only distracted, you're operating with reduced brain power. But when you keep your process private, your stress response begins to settle. The nervous system shifts out of a reactive state. The parasympathetic system activates, allowing for restoration, integration, and deeper focus. In this calm state, The brain becomes a fertile ground for new wiring. You're not just going through the motions, you're deeply engaging with them. The repetition has meaning. The discomfort teaches. And because your attention is whole, your brain learns more quickly and efficiently. There's also a deeper identity shift that happens in privacy. When no one is watching, your actions become pure. You're not influenced by the need to be seen a certain way. You're not adjusting your behavior based on audience perception. This purifies your intentions. It sharpens your self-awareness. And as your actions align more closely with your authentic values, the brain begins to form stronger identity circuits. You go from someone who wants to be disciplined to someone who is disciplined, from someone trying to be confident to someone who becomes confident. These shifts are encoded not through performance, but through presence. Neuroplasticity is not a magical process. It's biological, and it requires very specific conditions: deep focus, low stress, high repetition, and emotional relevance. Privacy gives you all of these. It shields your process from noise. It protects your nervous system from unnecessary stress. It gives your brain the single tasking environment it needs to wire new patterns with depth and durability. When you hold your growth in private, you give your brain the space it needs to reprogram itself. You stop building an identity that looks good and start building one that works. And in that silence, your brain, undistracted, unpressured, and fully engaged, becomes something sharper, stronger, and deeply transformed. Grit is not something you're born with. It's something the brain learns. It's a pattern of endurance coded into your nervous system through repetition, resilience, and delayed gratification. And interestingly, one of the most overlooked accelerators of grit is privacy. When no one is watching and you still choose to keep going, your brain begins to build the kind of strength that can't be manufactured through external pressure or public accountability. It's not loud, it's not glamorous, but biologically it's incredibly powerful, because when you work in silence, when your efforts are unseen and uncelebrated, the brain starts to rely on internal signals to push forward instead of external rewards. When you're performing in public, your nervous system is tuned to social cues. Praise, feedback, likes, recognition, all of these become motivators. And while they can drive short-term action, they don't build deep resilience. That's because social validation often triggers the release of serotonin and oxytocin, chemicals that signal safety and connection. When your brain feels safe too early, the urgency to push the resistance weakens. It's like your system exclaims, we're already okay, so why endure more pain? The shortcut to reward, when repeated often, teaches the brain to chase applause instead of growth. But grit doesn't come from safety. It comes from effort-based learning, from pushing forward when there is no recognition, no clapping, no eyes on you. That kind of repetition, when done in private, creates an entirely different set of adaptations in the brain. The ventral striatum, a key part of the reward system, begins to light up not in response to being seen, but in response to overcoming internal resistance. This is where true resilience begins to wire itself. Your brain starts to associate struggle with meaning. Your nervous system stops fearing discomfort and starts adapting to it. In silence, there are no shortcuts. And because of that, your brain has to do the hard work of building real drive that's not dependent on others, drive that's not borrowed from an audience. That drive becomes encoded over time as a pattern, a loop between your intention, your effort, and your self-reward. This loop gets stronger every time you show up for yourself, especially when no one else knows. You're not waiting to be motivated. You're building the muscle of momentum. There's also something deeply transformative that happens when you persist in isolation. When you're not performing for others, you're free to fail. And in neuroscience, failure is data. The brain learns through prediction error when your expectation doesn't match reality. Each time you fail and self-correct, the anterior cingulate cortex updates its internal map. It becomes more accurate. You get sharper. But when you're constantly being watched, you become afraid of failure. You play it safe. And when you play it safe, the brain stops learning. Working in silence means you can fail quietly, adjust internally, and try again without shame. It's the ultimate training ground for grit. You build a nervous system that's not afraid of being misunderstood, not afraid of making mistakes, not afraid of not being seen. That kind of autonomy rewires your identity. You stop needing motivation to act. You start seeing action itself as the source of motivation. And this flips a powerful switch in your brain from dependency to independence. The quiet path is not easy, but it is biologically rich. It creates a feedback loop of self-trust. You begin to expect hard things from yourself. And each time you meet that expectation, even in small, unnoticed ways, you deposit evidence into your brain's identity system. I am the kind of person who doesn't quit. That identity is reinforced through private effort, not public image. You're not just building habits. You're building a nervous system that leans into resistance instead of avoiding it. Public motivation is fragile. It cracks under pressure. But private grit is built for endurance. It's built through thousands of quiet reps where you show up, struggle, and grow without needing a witness. And your brain, recognizing that this effort is both voluntary and meaningful, adapts to carry more. You get stronger, not because someone told you to be, but because you trained to be. And that strength, coded through repetition in silence, becomes a foundation for everything you will one day reveal to the world. Not as a performance, but as proof. The prefrontal cortex is the most evolved part of the human brain. It's responsible for focus, decision-making, self-discipline, long-term planning, and emotional regulation. It is, in a very real sense, the command center of your identity. And like any other system in the brain, it strengthens through repetition, consistency, and reinforcement. One of the most powerful and overlooked ways to train the prefrontal cortex is through private victories, actions that are seen and rewarded by no one except you. Because when you do hard things without telling anyone, without broadcasting the effort, your brain learns to associate satisfaction with integrity, not attention. When you win in private, your brain isn't flooded with external validation. Instead, it starts to build internal reinforcement loops. These loops are part of the mesocortical dopamine pathway, connecting the ventral tegmental area, VTA, to the prefrontal cortex. Unlike the mesolimbic pathway, which deals with external reward and pleasure, the mesocortical pathway supports higher order cognition, resilience, and goal-directed behavior. What that means in simple terms is that private wins strengthen your ability to focus, delay gratification, and stay aligned with your values, even when no one is watching. Each time you tell yourself you'll do something and then actually do it, especially when it's hard, boring, or inconvenient, you're creating evidence for your brain that you are trustworthy, that your word to yourself matters. And this kind of evidence is fuel for the prefrontal cortex. It quiets internal doubt. It reduces the friction between intention and action. And over time, it reshapes the way you approach every decision. You don't need to feel like it. You don't need permission. You don't need a crowd. You act because you've trained your brain to lead, not react. When most people share their efforts publicly, especially before they've completed them, they shift the source of reward from the internal to the external. The brain starts craving applause rather than achievement. That shift might feel subtle, but it changes everything. You become more reactive, more emotionally dependent, more sensitive to judgment. But when your reward system is anchored in private effort, you become more emotionally self-sufficient. Your sense of progress is no longer based on how others see you, but on what you know to be true about yourself. This internal orientation is essential for building long-term consistency. The prefrontal cortex needs stability. It can't lead when the brain is in a constant state of emotional whiplash. Every time you rely on other people to notice your discipline or validate your work, you're handing over part of your mental command system. But when you grind in silence, when you choose to let your discipline speak louder than your declarations, you're reinforcing the prefrontal cortex's executive power. You're telling your brain, we act from within. We don't need noise to create clarity, and the effects compound. The more you complete hard things without needing to be seen, the more your brain begins to automate that behavior. The anterior mid-cingulate cortex, closely linked to the prefrontal cortex, becomes more active in sustaining difficult tasks. You become more immune to distraction, more resistant to emotional hijacking. You begin to carry a quiet confidence that isn't performative. It's structural. It's wired into you. That's the kind of presence you can't fake, the kind of leadership that doesn't announce itself, but is felt by everyone around you. Private wins also protect your goals from distortion. When goals are shared too early, they're shaped by feedback, opinions, and the subtle influence of others' expectations. But when a goal lives in silence, it has room to mature. It grows based on your values, your pace, your internal feedback. And as the brain commits to those kinds of goals, the neural pathways responsible for consistency, creativity, and strategic thinking deepen. You're not just chasing outcomes. You're becoming someone whose process is clean, focused, and aligned. The truth is, not everything needs to be documented. Not every success needs to be seen. In fact, the most meaningful transformations often happen in the dark, when you're alone, struggling, and still choosing to keep going. Those moments build a kind of internal power that can't be given or taken away by anyone else, and your brain knows the difference. It recognizes when your progress is real and when it's performative. It knows when you're showing up because it matters, not because it's trending. That knowing lives in the prefrontal cortex. And every private win, no matter how small, strengthens it until you become someone whose confidence is not built on being noticed, but on being consistent, someone whose self-worth is not dependent on approval, but on alignment, someone whose path is not about being followed, but about being true. The power of keeping your life private isn't about hidings. It's about protecting. It's about reclaiming your energy from the grip of performance and directing it into growth that is real, measurable, and lasting. When you stop announcing every step, you stop bleeding the very dopamine that fuels your drive. When you choose silence, your nervous system learns to regulate from within. When you keep your process private, your brain is free to rewire with clarity and depth. When you endure without applause, your grip becomes unshakable. And when your victories are quiet, your prefrontal cortex strengthens, building the kind of self-trust that can't be broken. In the silence of discipline, in the privacy of unseen effort, your identity begins to shift. You become less reactive, more intentional, less performative, more present. And in that shift, your brain becomes your greatest ally. Not just in reaching goals, but in becoming someone who no longer needs the world's permission to grow. Because your worth isn't found in how loud your life is. It's found in how deeply you live it. Privately, powerfully, permanently.